The question that is very often discussed and debated is whether vaccines contributed or not to the eradication of diseases.
Many people, even if they talk about the dangers of vaccines, will mention, they'll preface, oh, but, vaccines have saved us from all these diseases that were killing us. And I actually believed that for a long time. And I didn't start to question that until I started, looking at some of these graphs. In the 1900s, people died of scurvy. People died of tuberculosis. People died of yellow fever in this country. They died of scarlet fever. We never vaccinated away tuberculosis, yellow fever, scarlet fever. I use those as examples. People aren't dying of them in this country, right? And we didn't vaccinate away against it.
They say that the introduction of vaccines actually reduced the amount of infectious diseases. But if you go back to the beginning of the century, you will really see that the thing that was reducing infectious diseases was an improvement in diet, an improvement in sanitation, an improvement in education, the environmental things that were improving as a result of improving economies. The number of infectious diseases were going down. Many of the infectious diseases were already 90% reduced when the vaccines were introduced.
Edward Jenner, born in 1749 in England, was a country apothecary barber surgeon. He's revered as being the father of vaccination. Jenner formulated the idea of vaccination after a rumor he heard amongst the dairymaids that those who got cowpox were protected from smallpox. In order to test the theory, on May 14, 1796, he removed some fluid from a dairymaid named Sarah and injected into the arm of James Phipps, a healthy 8-year-old boy. Phipps contracted cowpox, and 6 weeks later, Jenner injected him with smallpox, in which he took the fluid from an actual pox. When James did not come down with smallpox, Jenner concluded, "The cowpox protects the human constitution from the infection of smallpox." This indeed is the entire basis upon which the entire field of vaccination rests.
Populations who were highly vaccinated against smallpox with the cowpox vaccine developed terrible epidemics at times when they were between 95 and 100% vaccinated. This was occurring in a town in England called Leicester, and 95% of the people in that town were vaccinated. So the leaders of that town decided to take matters into their own hands, and they stopped vaccinating. They cleaned up their dairies, they cleaned up their streets, they gave plumbing to people, they focused on nutrition, and within several years their smallpox outbreaks had gone down by 80%.
When smallpox was on its way out in the United States during the second half of the 20th century, the vaccine was still universally mandated. But a few public health officials and doctors discovered that, in fact, the smallpox vaccine had considerable risks and hazards and adverse consequences that people had not picked up on before, and in their eyes had become more dangerous than the disease itself, which had pretty much died out in the United States after 1949. These people initially were written off and seen themselves as dangerous because they were destabilizing the value of the smallpox vaccine. Within a few years, however, those independent-minded scientists had become the ones who were expressing the common wisdom, and smallpox vaccine was pretty much phased out across the mass of the population.
Look at death rates from all communicable diseases, and scurvy, because they're overlaid. You can see that the death rates were declining from 1900. They reached their bottom in early 1970. And in fact, after 1976 to 1986, it was pretty stable, but after 1986, death rates, especially pediatric death rates, but death rates in general from infectious diseases began to climb again. And even if you take HIV out of the equation, there are more people now dying from infectious diseases than there were in 1970.
Here are the actual government statistics from 1838 to when the vaccines were implemented in 1967. High back then, dropping. Guess what? We had better sanitation. We had cleaner water. We were pasteurizing milk. We had public health measures. And by the time the vaccines was introduced, it was 98% gone.
Measles was not a severe or deadly disease at the time when the vaccination was introduced. And yet, 30 years later, in the 90s, what transpired is that the last measles epidemic was considered very bad. 24% of all the measles cases started to happen in infants. The 80s and maybe 70s, we do have reports, epidemiological reports of measles in fully vaccinated communities.
There are academic papers that are termed the paradox of measles, meaning that you're more likely to contract measles in an outbreak if you have been vaccinated. In some of these outbreaks, not only were there every single child or teenager who contracted measles had been fully vaccinated, the few that weren't vaccinated did not come down with measles. And what was concluded? What was concluded was that the vaccinated were providing herd immunity for the unvaccinated. But think about that for 1 minute. That doesn't make any sense. If there was herd immunity from the vaccinated, why were they coming down with measles and the unvaccinated not?
Recently, we have seen outbreaks of mumps and pertussis in the last couple of years. And in the mumps outbreak that happened in Iowa about 2 or 3 years ago, we found that 67% of the children who contracted mumps had at least one, many of them two, MMR vaccines, so they should have been protected from getting the mumps. In the pertussis outbreaks that were happening in California, we found out that the vast majority of those children had pertussis vaccination and had the full series.
In my generation, we all had pertussis. We were immune for about 20 years, and then we'd be exposed to it again, which is how we maintained our immunity. And now that we're playing with this and with this ecosystem, we're seeing antigenic shifts, and we're seeing it in pertussis, but we're seeing it in other things as well. So those that are vaccinated get colonization of parapertussis in the throat. And so they're carriers of parapertussis. So in fact, it's the vaccinated who are creating the problem, not the unvaccinated.